Moreover, will the government publish a parallel violence against men and boys strategy to cover all forms of intimate violence against men and boys?
Well, the Noble Lord is absolutely right with his figures, and I think had we done it in the way that he suggested, there may have been a lot of complaints from women and domestic abuse organisations that actually we hadn't reflected the fact that it was predominantly women who suffered from domestic abuse.
The last few days have seen some interesting developments in relation to the campaign to secure a government strategy to adequately address the issue of intimate violence experienced by boys and men, culminating with a quite extraordinary statement in the House of Lords from the government's Minister of State for the Home Office, the Right Honourable Baroness Williams of Trafford. As a former Minister for Equalities, one might have expected the Baroness to have an opinion on the outworkings of government policy as they immediately relate to UK equality and human rights law, and yet she declined to either agree or disagree with Lord Farmer's informed opinion that the categorisation of male victims of sexual and domestic violence as victims of violence against women and girls is both semantic nonsense and makes a mockery of equality. She did, however, provide a refreshingly candid response to his call for the Home Office to develop a strategy to tackle violence against men and boys, to complement their ongoing work to tackle violence against women and girls, which, as you've just heard, was that to do so would be to risk criticism from women and domestic abuse charities. Or, as the chair of the organisation spearheading the campaign for a male victims strategy put it, somewhat scandalously, the minister indicated that both she and her government are prepared to throw one group of survivors of violence under the bus, simply to placate the perceived wishes and views of another. A group of survivors and victims of violence, by the way, whose realistic rights under existing equality law seem likely to be further significantly eroded very soon if the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, delivers on her pledge to ratify the Istanbul Convention into UK law at the end of July. Happily, however, at least in my humble subjective opinion, there is a very much glass half full perspective to present in relation to both such a surprisingly candid admission from a Home Office minister and how it was that she came to make it. And so for the next few minutes, I invite you to consider exactly what that might be.
Alright, gentlemen, let's do this.
What I would like to use my time today for is to raise a couple of questions which are key and fundamental to the discussion we're having here today. They're not hypothetical. We have put these questions to the Home Office on multiple occasions, and nobody has ever been able to answer these questions. So if anyone here in the room today is able to help us get answers to these questions, we'd be very grateful. And in the meantime, I think they'll probably help to illustrate the Alice in Wonderland absurdity of the kind of issues that we're dealing with here.
So firstly, major kudos to Ali Fogg, co-founder and chair of the Men and Boys Coalition, who has been patiently plugging away at this problem for many years. This presentation is largely based on a Twitter thread that he put out last week, commenting on a number of pertinent developments, including a presentation on the case for a violence against men and boys strategy that he and other members of the coalition recently gave to the all-party parliamentary group on men and boys. I'll include a link to the entire presentation, which is well worth watching. There were a number of other excellent speakers participating, but for now I want to focus on Ali Fogg's section, which succinctly and extremely effectively illustrates the absolute absurdity of the Home Office's current position. His presentation was built around the following three simple questions. Who was it that decided to categorise male victims of intimate violence as victims of violence against women and girls, and why? What is the role and function of the Home Office's position statement on male victims? And crucially, who is it exactly that actually supports the inclusion of male victims in a violence against women and girls strategy? And in attempting to answer the first of those questions, Ali Fogg began with a short potted history of why and how the Home Office came to develop a gender-specific strategy designed to specifically tackle violence against women and girls.
So, back in 1993, the UK government signed up to the UN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and in 2010 to the Istanbul Convention of the Council of Europe. Both of these treaties committed the UK government to considering violence against women and girls not just as an issue of criminality, but of gender equality and human rights. The signing of these treaties led to the creation of a violence against women and girls strategy. And when it first came out in 2010, I've got empty quote marks there on the page in front of you, because the original document that came out in November 2010 had no mention of male victims whatsoever. And why would it? Because men and boys are not victims of violence against women and girls. But over the 5 and 10 years after that, slowly, every update that the Home Office put out had another mention of male victims, just sneaking in here and there. And accompanying that, the definitions began to change. So by 2013, the definition said, as you can see there, violence against women and girls refers to types of abuse that are predominantly experienced by this group. However, there are also male victims of most of these crimes who need support and protection. I don't actually disagree with that statement as far as it goes, but by 2021, the current update of the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy said this: a note on terminology. The term violence against women and girls refers to acts of violence or abuse that we know disproportionately affect women and girls. And throughout this strategy, this refers to all victims of any of these offences. Now, before I move on, I'd like to point out that the reasoning given in that 2021 quote makes no sense whatsoever. I don't need to spell this out to you. Very obviously, this does not apply in any other realm of public policy. The overwhelming majority of rough sleeping homeless people are men, but we don't talk about all homeless people as homeless men. You can come up with any number of examples or equivalents, but there is no other area of public policy where this applies. And the second point I'd make is that while these definitions changed between 2010 and 2021, at no stage was there any kind of accountability or justification for the shift in that definition. No minister ever stood up in Parliament to announce it. No official was ever asked to explain or justify it to any committee. And perhaps most importantly of all, at no time did anyone ask male survivors or our representative organisations how we felt about being categorised as victims of violence against women and girls. It's a definition that's been entirely imposed upon us without consideration or consent. And when you think about the context of the issues we're dealing with here, that's actually quite profound and quite disturbing.
Presumably, one of the more obvious reasons why government departments haven't adopted a similar approach in any other realm of public policy will be because direct sex discrimination has been illegal in the entire UK since 1976. And it's no coincidence that the Home Office's move to formally ring-fence funding and public policy practices to favour domestic abuse charities, who quite literally don't want male victims about their place, came in the same year that the Equality Act was passed into law, introducing new duties on public bodies such as the Home Office, requiring them to formally assess what specific impact and outcomes their publicly funded actions have on protected groups such as women and men. All of which brings us to question 2, and the extraordinary mental gymnastics, doublespeak and distraction that the Home Office are increasingly having to indulge in when attempting to justify their current morally unjustifiable position on male victims of intimate violence.
It might sound unbelievable, but there was a period of about 4 or 5 years during which male victims and survivors were apparently included in the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, and we simply never knew because nobody bothered to tell us. When we pieced it together, we began to, as Duncan mentioned earlier, some of us began to lobby and badger the Home Office to clarify what was going on, and the upshot of that was the 2019 position statement. And then, a few years later, the 2022 update, which is the one we're now looking at. Now, the 2019 version was, to be generous, a rather flimsy document. It didn't say much. The 2022 version is, on its own terms, actually rather good. It's useful. It tells us that the government understands the horrifying extent of intimate violence against men and boys and the complexities of the situations that male victims find themselves in, including the intersections of male gender issues with race and ethnicity and sexuality and disability, social exclusion. All of these points are made very well in the document. It also includes this absolutely crucial line: whilst acknowledging the disproportionately gendered nature of VOG, we will ensure the government VOG communication campaigns are inclusive of male victims to raise awareness, challenge harmful societal myths about masculinity, and encourage male victims and survivors to report abuse. This is great. We need it. The problem is the Home Office do not tell anyone else involved in violence against women and girls strategy that this is what their position is. Some examples. Deputy Chief Constable Maggie Bly is currently tasked by the Home Office with delivering this national framework on policing violence against women and girls. Now, she has made it very clear, both in her published documents and in meetings with some of the sector, some of the people here today, that as far as she is concerned, policing violence against women and girls is about policing violence against women and girls. Male victims are not included in her work. She does not address the circumstances which led to the serial killer, Stephen Port, continuing to murder and rape and abuse a succession of young men and boys in London over the last decade, or the situations that emerged in Manchester where the serial rapist, Reynard Sanaga, attacked over 200 victims that we know of, all of them men. And these issues are simply not a concern. So the idea that the National Violence Against Women and Girls strategy is addressing issues for male victims is fundamentally false.
One crucial factor in all of this that many of us have understood for a long time is the inconvenient home truth that Baroness Williams candidly conceded in Parliament last Thursday. Namely that the Home Office and the UK government have been throwing male victims under the bus for over a decade, or at the very least directly discriminating against them and treating them as second-class citizens, all because of the persistent perception that to do otherwise would be to risk the ire of the extremely powerful and influential feminist-led violence against women and girls lobby that they fund to the tune of millions of taxpayer pounds and pence every single year. As Ali Fogg concedes, this isn't an entirely irrational perception, because many within that extremely powerful and influential feminist-led violence against women and girls lobby believe that any whiff of a proactive male strategy would be funded out of the extremely lucrative pot of taxpayers' money that has been effectively ring-fenced for the benefit of domestic abuse charities who generally want absolutely nothing to do with male victims. But then again, neither do they generally support the inclusion of male victims within the existing violence against women and girls strategy. And so perhaps Ali Fogg's most pertinent and pressing question is, does anyone actually know anyone other than the Home Office who actually does?
We know no one in the men's sector, in the victim support sector, supports it. We know the Victims Commissioner doesn't. We know most of our colleagues and friends in the women's sector don't support it. And I've never been able to find anyone who will actually stand up and say, yes, I think this is a good idea. It's just something that's happened, I presume, as an issue of kind of bureaucratic convenience for the sake of civil servants in the Home Office. We've not been able to find any other explanation for it at all.
And as Ali Fogg just alluded to, the famous feminist and victims commissioner Vera Baird shared the following unambiguous statement with the Men and Boys all-party parliamentary group, which very much backs this up. It has long been my view that there is insufficient focus on men and boys in the drive to tackle sexual violence, domestic abuse, and other forms of interpersonal violence, such as so-called honour-based abuse. Men and boys suffer a number of unique barriers when it comes to reporting and seeking help. This includes harmful stereotyping and popular myths and misconceptions around male victims. I have consistently argued that men and boys who are victims of interpersonal violence require their own strategy. The drivers of abuse differ, and in turn the harms and impacts are experienced differently. These calls are not new. My predecessor pushed for this, and male victims organisations have long campaigned for a separate and distinct male victim strategy. The Home Office can't claim to have been caught off guard by recent criticisms from me and others. Men and boys deserve better than recent lacklustre Home Office efforts. It is beyond time for the design of a dedicated men and boys strategy with specific policies, strategic targets, milestones and funding which sits independently of a violence against women and girls strategy. Physical and sexual violence and domestic abuse against men and boys is not violence against women and girls. The Home Office must stop being tone deaf on this issue and commit to a separate consultation and separate strategy for male victims. So why is it, you may ask, that government ministers still so often seem to be tone deaf and caught off guard when it comes to the matter of male victims of intimate violence? Well, Mark Brooks of the Mankind Initiative shared a pretty plausible theory with the group.
From my understanding, and working with Duncan and Ali and Liz and lots of others here, is that we don't think the ministers are actually thinking about this because we don't think they're being briefed to think about it. And that's one of the issues. I think they're being gatekeeped. Duncan and I and Ali have spoken personally to ministers about this, including the current Home Office Minister, Rachel McLean. And certainly, you know, it was clear when I spoke to her, she had not been briefed on these issues. So I think from our perspective, it's a request for the peers and the MPs to actually start to ask ministers to actually give this some thought and not to be gatekeeped by their civil servants.
And indeed, last week we witnessed yet another example of tone-deaf testimony that very much seems to support such a theory. Last Wednesday, the confusingly titled Women and Equalities Committee continued their follow-up inquiry into the mental health of men and boys, and after offering relatively robust and well-informed answers in relation to the mental health of men and boys from LGBT and ethnic minority backgrounds, for some reason the Minister for Care and Mental Health seriously struggled when it came to a more all-encompassing question about male victims of abuse.
Should there be more attention and support given by the government and civil society organisations to men and boys who experience violence, domestic and sexual abuse and related trauma and mental health issues? Minister Keegan, if you'd like to go first.
I don't actually have much input or information on this. I think it's an important point because there's obviously been a lot of work done recently on the sexual violence and domestic abuse in general. And I know I was on that bill committee as well, and I know it was very much, people were very keen to make sure that whilst it was, the numbers were overwhelmingly women who were impacted, then nonetheless it was very, very keen to make sure that men's voices were heard in that conversation, and that we had specific services that were there to make sure that men, we did have those services. And again, it will be something else where it's probably more stigmatized in terms of men coming forward. So I think there probably is some more work to do on that. And I know we've been building a lot of those services as a result of that landmark legislation that we recently passed. But I think probably there will be more work to do, and I think it's probably something that I don't know whether you've got any specific information, Zoe, or whether it's something we ought to come back and see if there's any specific work for men.
And can I just, on the back of what you said there, what do you think more the government could do to make it easier to destigmatise and, encourage men and boys to come forward?
It's having that conversation, isn't it? So again, it's engaging that conversation. I remember even with it's understanding that this is everybody's conversation. It's not just health. It's not just it's employers. It's other groups where you can basically build those relationships so that you feel comfortable enough to have those. What are quite difficult conversations for anybody to have, but I think it's really, really about normalising those discussions.
Troublingly, the minister with a responsibility for the mental well-being of a nation appeared to be entirely oblivious to the fact that her government recently published a specific position paper on their approach to helping male victims of domestic and sexual abuse. But then again, perhaps, why on earth would she, when the Home Office appear to be doing such a poor job of promoting and normalising inclusive discussions in this area, difficult as they may sometimes be?
At the very same month that the Home Office and the Home Secretary herself was launching the position statement that I just showed you, which was committing to being fully inclusive of male victims, they also launched this campaign called Enough. Here's one page of it. Just look at some of the examples. Ask the women and girls you know if they've ever felt threatened, harassed, controlled, or coerced, and the answer is likely to be yes. Any behaviour that embarrasses, demeans, frightens, or distresses women and girls is abuse, and it has to stop. There's pages and pages and pages of this. The best example, perhaps, are you worried about your behaviour? Have you ever made sexual comments about a woman to your mates, made suggestive comments to a woman when they were clearly unwelcome, pressured a woman for sex until she gave in, and so on and so on and so on? This is what the government considers to be communications that are fully inclusive of violence against men and boys. Now, when we raised this with the Home Office, I went back a short while later and they'd added this little footnote. A word about terminology. Throughout this website, we talk about abuse towards women and girls because we know these behaviours disproportionately affect them, but the support offered here is available to all victims of any of these harms. This is what they mean by a fully inclusive communications programme for men and boys as victims of violence against women and girls. It is, to be blunt, a nonsense. Now, this week, the Home Office is running an open competition to fund voluntary organisations to deliver this work, Preventing the AWG and the Supporting Children Fund. Last week, I was at a meeting for bidders or people who are interested in bidding for this work, and I raised the question: are the bidders who will be delivering this work, which will involve going into schools, talking to children, working with youth groups, working with communications materials that will directly address young people, are bidders obliged to adhere to the Home Office's definition of violence against women and girls? The answer came back to me that none. There is no obligation on any organisation to recognise that male victims even exist, and there were organisations involved at the meeting that I know for a fact have a stated position that domestic violence against men is not domestic violence. So we are in a position where the Home Office could soon be funding part of the violence against women and girls strategy work which directly contradicts a key component of their own violence against women and girls strategy. Why? Because the position statement is meaningless. It does not actually say what the government cares about, and it's why it's no longer fit for purpose. And what we urgently need is a set-aside parallel strategy that meets the unique gender-specific needs of male victims and men and boys.
All of which brings us full circle and back to the glass-half-full perspective on the shockingly candid confession from the Minister for Home Affairs that we heard at the start of this presentation. And that's where we have to congratulate everyone involved in the all-party parliamentary group for men and boys, most especially the 3 members from the House of Lords who subsequently presented the Minister for Home Affairs with a series of questions that helped to highlight just how irrational and indefensible the Home Office's current position really is.
Second oral question, Lord Ponsonby Shawbury.
I thank the noble lady for that answer, but does she agree with Dame Vera Baird, the government's Victims Commissioner? And I quote, "It is estimated that 1 in 6 men will experience sexual violence or abuse in their lives. The Home Office's refreshed Supporting Male Victims document, which is notably not a strategy, will do shamefully little to advance these male victims' interests. It's hard to escape the impression that male survivors are an afterthought." Does the Minister agree with that statement?
My Lords, just following on from that question, 1/3 of domestic abuse victims are men, and per the new Domestic Abuse Act, boys who witness domestic abuse are also victims. yet many male victims of violence are categorised as victims of, quote, violence against women and girls, while others have no specific policy. Does the Minister agree that this categorisation is semantic nonsense and that ignoring men's specific needs makes a mockery of equality?
Position paper in itself inadequate in that while it outlines many of the barriers that men face, it does very little to actually address them. Mankind and other charities are calling for a full-blown strategy called the Intimate Violence and Abuse Against Men and Boys Strategy. Doesn't the suffering of men deserve to be treated as equally valid as that of women?
Hear, hear. So once again, well done to everyone involved at patiently chipping away at this particular massive government glass blind spot. As Ali Fogg observes, it is quite an overwhelming feeling to finally witness a not insignificant number of parliamentarians finally not turning a blind eye to such overtly discriminatory practices. I appreciate that it's not always easy to maintain optimism when seeking to address this all too unfashionable area, but I'll finish by signal boosting Ali Fogg's appeal that if you want to help and you want to see change sooner rather than later, then the best thing you can do right now is to alert your MP about your concerns and let them know you care.
Had we done it in the way that he suggested, there may have been a lot of complaints from women and domestic abuse organisations.
Can't you see it too? There is an elephant in the room.